Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please register for the course. Everyone signed in? No. No? I'll wait a second or two more. All right, everyone is in, right? Checked, all signed in, registered, good. All right, for today, this morning lecture is in the auditorium, so that's fine. This afternoon, unfortunately, is still split up between 1:05 two times at 5 o'clock and at 10 to 6. So please do come at your scheduled time. We don't have that much room in 1:05 to cover you all. So please come to the time slot 5 or 10 to 6, which is actually on your schedule. So that's for the morning announcements, and then we'll continue to the content of this first lecture on airline networks. Good morning, come in. In the beginning of the course, we will try to give you some general overview what's happening in the airline industry, same as what Gert is doing, but also trying to focus more around airline networks. So today is a bit of a starting point towards that, well, goal. So for this morning, we're going to focus on air traffic, and of course on the air traffic flows, why that's important, continuous hub, what it is, and well, where it's used and where do you still see it in use, traffic development, and something about seasonality of air traffic, which is also relevant when you're planning your network. So this is only for this 50 minutes or 45 at the moment. So something to consider when you are planning your network as an airline. People have choice. They can go by train, car, they can even walk if they want, but air travel is an option. And when you consider with different modes of transport, it depends of course on the distance and how well you can access a different terrain. If there are mountains in between or a lake, then it becomes very easy to travel by, well, boat or plane instead of going by car or walking. So on shorter distances, you have some competition. So the denser the area is, with more airports in the vicinities, the more options there are for people to go between two large cities. Instead of, well, going to Schiphol, for instance, and waiting there 3 hours before you can even depart, or when you can board the plane even. And in that time, you can already have gone by train from Amsterdam to Paris. So then it doesn't make that much sense to take a flight from Amsterdam to Paris. So you have some competition. And you have to realize that when you're selling tickets, you're not only competing in the air with your competition, but you're also competing with different modes of transport. So consider those things when you're creating, well, networks. You already have your destination, your block assignments, but of course, this course also provides some further insight on, well, how to do it later on. All right. Another important factor in, well, running an airline is, of course, an aircraft on the ground doesn't make any money. So your flight schedule needs to, well, make sure the aircraft is in the air. It's going flying constantly. And one of your most expensive assets is, of course, the aircraft. So having, for instance, long turnaround times reduces your utilization, one of the main KPIs in airline networks, utilization of your aircraft. The moment you have 2-hour ground time, well, it's nice, of course, for passengers and nice, of course, to make connections, but of course, reduce your utilization of the aircraft. Then you have to maybe increase your ticket prices to compensate, of course, for being on the ground more instead of flying. When you're creating your network or routes within that network, you have to consider frequencies. So how often do I operate a certain route? Is there demand to operate that often per day, per week, per month, or what type of aircraft do I use? Small, medium-sized, large, maybe just an Embraer 175 or something, or larger. Depends on demand. And that is more the head part of the business, because then you have to look at, okay, how much passengers can I attract, and what ticket prices can I ask for those specific frequencies and destinations. But you need to have traffic rights. So you need to be able to fly to those destinations. You cannot just choose as an airline, all right, I'm based in Amsterdam and I can go anywhere in the world. No, you need to know if you are able to fly to operate to those destinations. Or else you need to attain certain rights. Maybe join up or have an alliance with someone else to make sure you can operate to those destinations. You can, well, give your passengers the opportunity maybe to transfer at another airport, but the ticket is being sold by your own airline. You have to also consider congested airports, because airports, especially in facilities like Europe, especially on the western side, congested airports or restricted airports. And let's say slot coordinated airports, that's even better, because they have a restriction on the amount of flights. So that means, well, if you want to go there, maybe you are able to fly, you have the aircraft, there's demand, but then you'll arrive at midnight or something because that's the only available time slot. Well, then becomes the question, can you sell that time slot that late? Are passengers willing to travel to the airport? Yes, but not in that time maybe. So congestion at airports also very important, and later on I will also show you an example between London and Amsterdam why that is becoming more and more important, especially at busy airports. On the airport side, on the ground you have congestions, but you also have congestion in the airspace. The air traffic flow congestions because of, well, how busy it is in the airspace, and maybe you have to be in holding. If you go straight in without any delays, it takes you 30 minutes, but with the delays maybe 40 minutes. Additional flight time, additional fuel being burned. So you also have to consider those items when you're planning a network. But also the scheduling, as mentioned, someone is not willing to arrive in the airport at 2 o'clock at midnight. And especially when there's no transfer opportunity towards a hotel or something. You cannot sell that as a favorable ticket. So you have to consider when to depart and when to arrive. And is that a sellable ticket? But also considering your flight crew, because it also relates, well, what time do you start that flight? Also means how much time can they perform their duty. So all these things are related. And am I crossing time zones, yes or no? Also very important. But you'll go through those items later on during the workshops in the upcoming weeks also. And also when you block assignments. All right. So what you also have to consider, and I mentioned that last week, the hub-spoke networks and the alliances. The alliances making these options possible, creating a large network between hub airports, the big aircraft, and the small aircraft to call the spoke operations. And the moment, for instance, you're departing from here, you have the opportunity to go via the hub airport to all these connections, but also on this side. So that means you're creating a lot of city pairs, options to fly between which airport, which destination you want to go. So with an alliance network, you have a lot of opportunity. But it means also scheduling becomes very complex and difficult. Because you need to take into account when you arrive, when the other flight of the alliance partner is departing, and how much time is in between, and how much time is needed for transfer. Because transfer at Schiphol, it is very well organized in that sense. Those 50 minutes, maybe 45, 60, that is very well organized. there are not many airports in the world that have that short of a minimum connecting time. MCT for short, you know that from the first year. So how you organize your network and how you connect to your partners, or how well you operate, if you just put in point to point like an EasyJet, just fly everywhere, or Ryanair, well, then you don't have to consider MCT. You don't have to consider when you arrive, and you just consider, all right, is someone willing to pay for this ticket, yes or no? Okay, we'll fly, we'll operate that route, and we'll fly 6 times a day. So, your network consists out of city pairs, and that's what you're selling to your customers. They go to your website, and they say, okay, this is my origin airport, and I want to fly to, okay, what are my options? And or it's within an alliance network, within your own network, hub spoke operation, or, well, let's say point to point. But that all needs to be scheduled. All right, let's consider one of the other important network metrics or KPIs, besides utilization of the aircraft, is also the passenger kilometers. Because you're selling a seat. You're selling a seat between one and two the other destination. And often we, well, try to indicate our capacity we use by the available seat kilometers or the passenger kilometers performed. So how much passengers actually were on that flight over a certain distance. And this is from the IATA 2016. And this indicates the total amount of passengers in 2016 on a flight over a certain distance. So that means that in Asia, of the total air traffic, passengers carried over distance was 11%, and in Europe 18 almost. So there's a big chunk of air traffic happening in Asia, Europe, and also North America, by the way. And in between the regions, it is not that large. The only regions to the northern hemisphere are, in this case, well, between Europe and North America, and Asia and Europe. It's just making noise, right? So it's very important to realize that those connections between the continents is driving a lot of traffic coming in. Needs to be, well, connecting flights at Amsterdam, London Heathrow, whatever, and continuing on within Europe. So there's a lot of traffic happening there. So this is 2016. And of course, say going to Sydney or something, or Australia is not that of a big route, or not that much activity happening there. It is expensive, so not that much people, well, traveling those distances. So this is this year, and actually what you have seen that it is relatively stable. Europe dropped a bit, Asia also dropped a bit, but the Middle East increased a bit, primarily Turkish Airlines, Dubai, providing those additional flights. So there is still something happening, and more on the eastern side of the world than, say, on our side, western side. East-west, doesn't matter that much. But the important thing to realize here is that there's a lot of air traffic happening in between all these cities and all these continents. And as an airline, you want to pick up passengers. You want to have sufficient load factors. Also a very important metric, seat load factors or load factors. You want to take a part of that market and of course have those passengers on your aircraft, not on the competition's aircraft. But it depends where you fly. So probably selling a ticket from Europe to, well, the farthest point downwards, Cape Town or something, well, if you operate it 8 times a day, then probably you will not succeed, because that is not a very thick route. There's not that much demand going that way 8 times a day. And there is demand from left to right, but there's also more competition. So you can go to a niche, but then you need to consider how often, which aircraft. But you can also go to, well, where everybody goes, but then you have to realize, well, then you probably would compete on price. and they need to have low unit costs. But okay, consider these items when you're creating a network. So talking about competition, this is an example from Paris to Orlando, 1985, so that's a long time ago. Some of you were just born. And not going directly to Orlando. This is very typical for the United States because of the traffic rights. You may not enter the United States directly as a European airline and go straight towards a major city in the United States in that time. So you needed always to go to, New York or Atlanta, and then maybe another airline transfers you from your Air France to Delta or whatever connection you're making. And 1985, there were only two routes in this case, via New York or via Atlanta. That's it. If you take 10 years later, 1996, then the picture changes a bit. Then you see there is a growth in competition, and more airlines are offering via different airports also that connection. In here there's still no direct connection, but nowadays there is. But you see a lot of airlines connecting through a large airport and then continuing on. So they're already operating in, let's say an alliance type or code sharing agreements to make sure that all passengers coming in from Europe can transfer and go to Orlando in this case, via different connections. Indirect flights instead of direct flights. Something to consider, there's a lot of competition. The North Atlantic route is very busy. You can enter that one like Norwegian is doing at the moment, offering flights via Reykjavik to the US for around 400 euros or something, instead of taking a flight Amsterdam to, let's say, Miami for 1600 euros. So there's a big price difference. So if you want to compete on a busy route, then you need to have something special. If it's a lower price and you can maintain that, probably then you can take a chunk of that route and attract passengers. But then you need to have low operating costs. And Gert will mention those specific items to you in the upcoming weeks. So routes are always being flown already, or in the past someone already operated those and went out because there wasn't sufficient demand and went bankrupt maybe. So demand is something you need in your network. You're not going to fly when passengers are not going to pay for that one. It's that simple. I just mentioned briefly minimum connecting times, especially for hub-spoke operation. That's very important. For point-to-point operation, not connecting any flights, it's not relevant. Flying to major airports like Amsterdam or Frankfurt or even Sydney or Delhi or something, when there is even a separation between domestic and international terminals, you need to know as an airline, okay, how much time do I need to take into account to transfer from one flight, the one gate, to the other one so that the passenger can continue. And if it takes you 3 hours on the airport to transfer because you're coming in internationally, you need to go to a domestic terminal, that increases, of course, your total flight time, your total travel time. So these things you need to consider. So as mentioned, Schiphol with the 40 minutes is between short haul, by the way, is very short. Considering the other airports like Brussels, but Brussels is not a big airport anymore, but will become a bigger airport. Frankfurt, London, Heathrow, 45, 50, 60 minutes. That is actually very normal for a hub airport. But the shorter the MCT becomes, the more complex it becomes also to manage all the flights coming in within a bank, all the short haul and longer flights coming in, and making sure that all the passengers can transfer within those 45 minutes. Because if one is delayed, it has an effect on the other flights. So a point-to-point network is very easy actually to maintain, better than having to organize your whole scheduling around a couple of moments during the day when you have 50 minutes of transfer time, all the flights need to come in, passengers running around, go back to the other aircraft, and then fly out again. So that's a very complex scheduling of your network. But that's what the full service carriers operating a hub-spoke network continuously do. Figuring out, okay, that much time I need on the ground, which aircraft goes where, which passenger goes where at the airport, at the gate, do I need to locate my operation? All these things affect how often you can operate a certain flight, and of course also your utilization. Because if you have a 30 minutes turnaround time, is nice, but then still maybe you have to wait 30 minutes, even if you have activities already done for the transfer passengers. All these things you need to consider in network. Minimum connecting times of, well, hub airports. As mentioned in the content, you have a continuous hub. Well, actually, it's like a metro system. You just have a continuous flow of aircraft, in this case, coming in after 30 minutes or 1 hour, continuous during the day. So it's 7 o'clock, 8, 9, 10, 11, etc. during the whole day. And of course, an outbound flight. So you have inbounds and outbounds. So that makes transfer throughout the whole day possible. Without saying to a passenger, you're transferring from that flight specifically to the other specific flight. No, you come at the airport, you can take that one. Oh, you missed that one, you take the next one. Just like a big hub train station, Utrecht or Amsterdam or whatever, or a metro station, those things. And those principles were used already by a few airlines in the world. American Airlines, for instance, used that one to have a continuous hub, just to fly aircraft in and fly aircraft out, and you transfer at the airport on any flight that comes in and you can go on to. And within the book of Goedeking, he also mentions how the continuous hub works in more detail. Just take a look at it. It makes some sense to have that, but it's very difficult to sell to a passenger, all right, you come in at 8 o'clock, but you're probably going to make the connecting flight at 10 and not at 9. Why not? Yeah, it's full. So passengers like comfort and need to know exactly which flight they are connecting, give them some certainty in their, well, travel time. But it's something you can sell. And that is also something Ryanair and EasyJet also indicated. Yeah, why not? We come in every time. What does it matter? Creating the opportunity for self-hubbing, like Gateway Connect or via Milano. Having the opportunity to indicate to the passenger, well, you can connect yourself. Because there is a flight coming in and there's a flight going out. If it takes 2 hours, okay. And sometimes even you see that passengers nowadays take more time coming in, say, oh, you know what, I will take 2 days in addition on that airport, go and see the city and take the other flight onward. That's an opportunity you can create with those, well, for instance, continuous hub systems. So here's a small example of a continuous hub. And you would say, well, it becomes very difficult, but you need a lot of aircraft. That's one. So 450 departures per day. So that requires a large fleet. 30 minutes minimum connecting time between the flights. So that means you have a arrival bank of, well, say half hour, 60 flights coming in from one direction, flights coming in from the other direction, and all coming towards that airport. And then making sure that every connection can be made within those 30 minutes. And then flying out of the limit. And then they come out and back and so forth. So it continues throughout the day. There's no one large peak or a few large peaks. No, it's stabilized throughout the day. And you're making the connections on the airport. Or you can organize it to east-west or north-south. It depends on, of course, where your traffic flows primarily are going from the airport. What is most interesting. For Amsterdam, it would be more to the south, because more people are going to the Mediterranean than going to the north to Scandinavia. But it is one way to organize a hub structure. So there's no specific directly connecting flight. No, there are 2 or 3 connecting flights that are an option. That worked, and well, some airlines, low costs, are trying to introduce it again in Europe in this case, seeing if it's going to work. Because people are used to traveling that way already when you're considering trains. So why not also incorporate that in the network of an airline or an airport? So this picture here means that Brussels maybe can be done 8 times a day, but Rome maybe 5 times a day. So it's not an equal amount of flights coming in from every direction. Also something to consider. So your combination with the block time, with the turnaround time, you can determine how often I can operate. But still, this doesn't say anything about the amount of demand. If there's no demand, it doesn't make sense to go 8 times a day. Well, of course, you can make a company visit with your employees and have them party all day, but it doesn't bring you any money. All right, so to see what happened in those networks of airlines in the, well, say 10, 15 years ago, maybe even 20, it's also important to realize what happened in Europe, and especially in Europe, because Europe is becoming a market where local carriers are a bit dominating the market instead of the full service carriers. So let's take the routes from London to the major hubs in Europe, Milan, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, and those things. Actually, when those low-cost carriers entered those markets, they increased the amount of flights between those cities. So there was more demand actually than those full-service carriers realized, because they were competing on price. Because in one go, there was an opportunity to fly from Amsterdam to London or London to Amsterdam for, well, let's say 60 euros instead of 200 euros on a KLM flight. Big difference. So those low-cost carriers really stimulated the market and travel in Europe. Also between the major airports. EasyJet more, of course, because they already operate to major airports. Ryanair somewhat less, and they're now, well, the last 5 years more going to large airports, because their goal was secondary airports, or even airports you never heard of before they started operating. So these guys really stimulated the market in Europe for everyone, make it more accessible in that sense. And of course that growth also on the somewhat secondary airports, or primary routes and secondary airports, also continued to be stimulated by those guys. Because BA, KLM, Lufthansa were still operating, of course, but they were operating to make those connections with those larger aircraft, going intercontinental, making those connections to transfer these passengers. And these guys said, well, yeah, not everybody's willing to transfer and is willing to, well, fork up that additional fare, because, well, actually that O&D passenger doesn't bring that much in for a regular airline. So they left that market a bit untapped, and those low-cost guys, well, jumped in. Yeah, let's go for it. So there's a large growth stimulated by those low-cost guys. But this is 2012, 5 years ago. That growth numbers are going down a bit. It's still increasing, but not with 100 or 40%. Because within Europe, the market is becoming a bit saturated. It's becoming more a mature market at the moment. And we're on top of that S-curve because the growth is a bit going out in total. Because, well, you cannot operate more and more and more, because, well, you need still to have passengers willing to pay for those flights. And if there are not more passengers, you're not going to operate more. But in the beginning, it was nice to stimulate, especially those regions like, well, the Mediterranean, going down to Italy and those things for vacations were very much stimulated by those low-cost carriers entering those markets. Or because there were no flights, or there were just a few flights a week. And now there are, well, multiple flights a day from towards all these airports. But again, those growth numbers, of course, nowadays are not that high anymore. But still growing, but not that much. So low cost has a big impact because they didn't have the traditional network that Hub spoke. They had that point to point. I just want to go from London to Venice and that's it, or Naples. I don't want to transfer to Russia or something, or to Bangkok or whatever. So they could sell more directly towards what the customer actually wanted. This was that ticket, and that's it. Without the additional frills, of course, with the peanuts and the beverage and such things. But that's a different cup of tea, talking about auxiliary revenues. So to go towards the few last slides I have, what you also need to consider is that demand throughout the year is not a constant factor. It is stimulated by what happens throughout the year. So let's call it seasons. July, August, especially when the majority of Europe goes on vacation, then of course there's a higher demand. And of course multiple airlines also focus around having a summer schedule and of course a winter schedule. And it makes a lot of sense. So seasonality has a large impact on how much aircraft you need and how often you operate. So it could be in a summer schedule you will operate between a destination 10 times a day, but in a winter schedule only 4. That reduces your utilization of the aircraft. Maybe also the demand for staff, flight attendants, flight crew and all those things. Because, well, you're flying less, you're operating less in the winter. But still you want to sell maybe the 7 o'clock flight and take out the 11 o'clock flight. Because, well, the 7 o'clock flight is driven by business passengers and 11 o'clock more by leisure passengers. So you need to consider between the summer and winter schedule what are the important frequencies, which aircraft I'm going to use, and of course, well, to which destinations are still important. Because it could be that in the winter you have different destinations in your portfolio than the summer schedule. So this is for the UK airports, by the way. And in 2008, of course, that seasonality is still there. The total increased because, well, the flight movements increased, but still the seasonality, the July, August, the summer schedule is still there. And that's also something we see at, for instance, Amsterdam or Frankfurt, any major airport, you see a lot of seasonality. Also the secondary airports, and go to, well, Bergamo or something, you see those seasonality numbers. But because people like to go on holidays in the summer and not in the winters. Well, they like to go throughout the whole year, but those months are more interesting. So keep that in mind when you're creating a schedule. It's possibly a summer schedule, but also a winter schedule. There's a difference in the output, a difference in how much seats you offer. This is how much frequency you offer for the passengers. And of course, on what time may be departure. That could also be a considering factor. If you look at the available seat kilometers, as mentioned before, is one of the important network methods to indicate how much capacity you put into the market. Available seat kilometers. And this is for the low-cost carriers in 2000, well, probably 15 or 16. I think 16. And you see here typically that Ryanair and EasyJet, because those are the two top graphs, have a large capacity in the market, and that's May, June, July, August, September. For them is the majority of activities. And there's a winter dip. There's only 3 or 4 months, and then they fly less. But the rest of the year, for them, is very good. And of course, Ryanair has a more peakier type of graph than, for instance, EasyJet. EasyJet is somewhat flatter. And there are some airlines like, well, where is it? Can I see it correctly? Well, the graphs overlap. But there are some airlines like Transavia or Wizz Air. Wizz Air is at the moment climbing. They're relatively stable. In some cases there is, and especially if you look at German wings, that is the red one, is relatively flat because they are also operating more in a hub spoke, making connections at different airports, but also operating for Lufthansa. So they have a relatively spread out capacity throughout the year because they are working with a full service carrier in this case. So some network metrics you have to consider in the upcoming weeks, but also probably in the workshop upcoming morning and afternoon. Available seat kilometers, ASKs, very important. And if you talk about ASKs, and Gert will talk about CASK, the cost available seat kilometer, because that's the business side. RPKs, revenue passenger kilometers, so actually passengers on a seat over a certain distance. Just passengers, very important. Block hours. Stage length is going to be an interesting one, and you will figure out what that is in a moment. Sectors, routes, served airports, operated aircraft, all those things are relevant. And with a few of these metrics you can create, for instance, if you take the finances into account, your CASK, the revenues available seat kilometer utilization per aircraft or total fleet utilization, the cost maybe per route or per block hour, the passengers you have over a certain route or city pair, but also how much passengers depart on average on every flight. To figure out, for instance, if your aircraft are not too large or too small. Do I have a lot of overbookings and all those things? So all these numbers say something about how well your network performs. And do I need to make adjustments, yes or no? Do I need to increase the frequency or lower the aircraft size because it's too big for that specific route? So all these things are relevant to consider when you're looking at your network. So this afternoon we will continue more specific topics. So I will leave you with a quote, and hopefully I will see you in a couple of hours.